The world outside is growing quiet, and a story is waiting for you in the stillness. Welcome to Midnight Murmurs Studio, your safe harbor from the noise of the day. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Before our story begins, a gentle reminder for your peaceful rest. For the deepest sleep, it's best to keep your phone at a safe distance from your head. So please take a moment to place your phone on a nearby table or chair. And while it's in your hand for this last moment, a quick tap on like and subscribe becomes a quiet signal to us, a soft murmur in the dark that lets us know these stories are a comfort to you. It's what keeps our studio going. Thank you for that. Now, settle in and let the outside world fade away. The village of St. Clair did not simply exist. It slumbered. Tucked away in a valley between two slumbering giants of the Alps, it was a place where winter was not a season, but a permanent resident. On this particular night, the snow had been falling since dusk, huge, fluffy flakes that descended in absolute silence, covering the slate roofs, the iron lampposts, and the winding cobblestone streets in a thick, pristine blanket of white. It was 3 in the morning. The hour of the wolf, some called it, but for Julian, it was the hour of the doe. Julian walked down the main street, his boots crunching softly into the fresh snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the only sound in the entire world. The village was fast asleep. The windows of the timber-framed houses were dark, their inhabitants tucked deep under down comforters, dreaming of spring. But Julian loved the cold. He loved the way the icy air nipped at his nose and cheeks, making him feel alive, awake, and singular. He pulled his wool scarf tighter around his neck. The street lamps cast pools of amber light on the snow, creating sparkling diamonds that vanished as soon as he stepped past them. St. Clair was beautiful in the day, bustling with tourists and skiers, but at night, it was a painting that belonged only to him. It was a world suspended in time, holding its breath under the weight of the snow. At the end of the lane, a single sign creaked gently in the wind. The Gilded Crumb. A soft, golden light spilled from the crack beneath the door, staining the snow yellow. This was his destination. This was his sanctuary. The moment he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key. It was cold against his fingers. He slid it into the lock of the bakery door. The mechanism turned with a satisfying, heavy clunk. He pushed the door open, and a bell overhead jingled softly, a cheerful, lonely sound in the quiet night. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the world changed. The biting cold of the Alps vanished, replaced instantly by a wall of warmth. The air inside the bakery was thick, humid, and sweet. It smelled of caramelized sugar, toasted flour, vanilla bean, and the faint, earthy scent of yeast that had been cultivating for decades. It was a smell that bypassed the brain and went straight to the soul, triggering a memory of safety, of home, of being cared for. Julian closed the door behind him, locking out the wind, locking out the snow, locking out the chaos of the modern world. Here, in the bakery, time moved differently. It moved at the speed of rising dough. He hung his heavy coat on the rack, stomped the snow off his boots, and slipped into his work shoes, soft-soled leather loafers that made no sound on the flour-dusted wooden floor. He tied his apron around his waist. It was white, stained with the ghosts of 1,000 loaves of bread. He walked to the center of the kitchen. The ovens were massive, built of brick and iron, taking up the entire back wall. They were never truly turned off. They hummed with a low, dormant heat, like sleeping dragons waiting to be wakened. Julian placed his hand against the warm brick. It was a greeting. "Good morning, old friends." He began his lighting ritual. He opened the iron door of the main oven and arranged the kindling, dried birch and oak. He struck a long match. The flame flared, blue and yellow. He touched it to the wood. The fire caught, crackling softly. Snap, pop, hiss. The sound was rhythmic, comforting. As the fire grew, the orange glow spread across the kitchen, illuminating the copper pots hanging from the ceiling and the rows of ceramic mixing bowls stacked on the shelves. The Julian moved to the massive wooden workbench in the center of the room. The wood was worn smooth, dipped in the center from centuries of kneading. It was an altar to the grain. He went to the pantry and brought out the mother. It was a large glass jar filled with his sourdough starter, a bubbling, beige mixture that was technically alive. This specific culture had been kept alive in St. Clair for over 80 years, passed down from baker to baker. It smelled sharp, tangy, and wildly organic. He removed the lid. The starter sighed, releasing a bubble of gas. Bloop. Julian poured warm water into a massive ceramic bowl. He checked the temperature with his wrist. Not too hot, not too cold, just right, like a bath for a baby. He added the starter, watching it dissolve into a milky cloud. Then came the flour. He scooped it from a large bin using a wooden scoop. The sound of the flour sliding into the bowl was soft, like sand shifting in the desert. Shh. Shh. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light coming from the fire. He didn't use a machine. Machines were loud. Machines were aggressive. Bread required a gentle hand. He plunged his hands into the mixture. The water was warm, the flour silky. He began to mix, his movements slow and circular. He wasn't just combining ingredients, he was waking them up. There was a meditative rhythm to it. Fold, push, turn. Fold, push, turn. The sticky mess slowly began to transform, becoming cohesive, elastic. It pulled away from the sides of the bowl with a wet, sticky sound. Squish, slap, squish. To anyone else, it might have been just cooking. To Julian, it was a conversation with the earth. Wheat, water, salt, fire. The four elements meeting in his hands. Once the dough was formed, smooth and taut as a drum skin, Julian placed it in a clean bowl and covered it with a damp linen cloth. Now began the most important part of the process, the wait. In a world that was obsessed with speed, with instant notifications and same-day deliveries, baking was an act of rebellion. You could not rush the yeast. You could not bribe the gluten. It would take as long as it took. Julian washed his hands, the cool water soothing his skin. He dried them on a towel and walked over to the window. He looked out at the street. The snow was falling heavier now. The footprints he had made just an hour ago were already filling up, disappearing. The village was being reset. St. Clair was disappearing under the white. Inside, the bakery was silent, save for the crackle of the wood in the oven and the ticking of the pendulum clock on the wall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was a slow, lazy sound. Julian made himself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, with a splash of milk. He didn't drink coffee. It was too jagged. Tea was smooth. He sat on a stool near the oven, basking in the radiant heat. He wrapped his hands around the hot mug. He watched the steam curl up from his cup, twisting into shapes that dissolved into the air. He thought about the people sleeping in the houses above, the doctor, the school teacher, the old widow who lived on the hill. In a few hours, they would wake up. They would come here, stamping the snow off their boots, their faces flushed with cold. They would buy his bread, warm and crusty. They would break it open, steam rising from the soft interior, and they would eat. And for a moment, they would feel safe. They would nourished. That was why he worked in the dark. That was why he embraced the solitude. He was the guardian of their morning. He was the keeper of the warmth. But for now, it was just him, the fire, and the sleeping dough. The peace in the room was heavy, almost tangible. It weighed down on his eyelids. The storm raged silently outside, a swirling chaos of ice. But in here, everything was warm, everything was rising, everything was exactly as it should be. He took a sip of tea, leaned his head back against the warm brick wall, and let the silence of the bakery wash over him like a gentle tide. An hour passed, then two. The pendulum clock on the wall continued its slow, methodical march. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Outside, the blizzard had not relented. If anything, the wind had picked up, turning the world beyond the glass into a swirling vortex of white noise. But inside the Gilded Crumb, a different kind of magic was happening. Julian set his empty tea mug down and walked back to the large ceramic bowl. He lifted the linen cloth. The dough had risen. It had doubled in size, bubbling and swelling with life, pressing against the sides of the bowl like a living thing taking a deep breath. It smelled sour and sweet, a primitive, earthy aroma that spoke of harvest and history. He tipped the bowl, and the dough slid onto the floured workbench with a soft, heavy thud. It was a satisfying sound, heavy and wet. Julian dusted his hands with flour. Poof! A tiny white cloud rose into the air, dancing in the firelight before settling like snow on the wooden table. Now began the shaping. This was Julian's favorite part. He didn't just mold the dough, he massaged it. He treated it with respect. He used a metal bench scraper to divide the mass into smaller portions. Scrape, cut, scrape. The metal against the wood made a dull, rhythmic sound. He took a portion of the dough and began to roll it. His hands moved in practiced, fluid circles. He tucked the edges underneath, creating surface tension, making the skin of the dough smooth and tight. He was shaping boules, round, rustic loaves that would have a thick, singing crust. He worked in silence, his mind completely empty of worry. There was only the tactile sensation of the soft, cool dough against his warm palms. It was soft as a pillow, yielding yet resilient. He lined a series of wicker baskets, called bannetons, with linen and flour, and gently placed each shaped loaf inside to rest for their final rise. It was like tucking children into bed. "Sleep now," he whispered to the loaves. "Rest before the fire." The dough worked. A soft noise came from the back of the bakery, near the pantry. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, vibrating sound. Purr, purr, purr. From behind a stack of flour sacks emerged Barnaby. Barnaby was a massive, orange tabby cat who technically belonged to no one and everyone in St. Clair. But on nights like this, when the temperature dropped below freezing, he always found his way to the warmest place in the village, the bakery. Barnaby stretched, his claws extending into the wood of the floor, his back arching into a perfect U shape. He yawned, showing a flash of pink tongue, and then padded softly over to the oven. He didn't meow. He knew the rules of the quiet hours. He simply curled up on a folded burlap sack near the warmth of the bricks, tucked his nose under his tail, and instantly went back to sleep. Julian smiled. The presence of the cat added a layer of coziness that was impossible to manufacture. A sleeping animal is a sign of safety. It tells our primal brain that there are no predators nearby, that the fire is warm, and that we can relax. Julian walked over and crouched down. He gently scratched Barnaby behind the ears. The purring intensified, sounding like a small diesel engine running in the corner of the room. The cat didn't wake up, just leaned into the touch. Julian felt the softness of the fur, the warmth of the small body. It was a simple connection, a moment of shared peace between two living creatures sheltering from the storm. The fire in the oven was now a bed of glowing, intense coals. The temperature was perfect. It was time. Julian flipped the rested loaves out of their baskets onto a long wooden peel, a shovel-like tool used to slide bread into the fire. The dough held its shape perfectly. He took a small, incredibly sharp blade called a lathe. This was the surgeon's scalpel of the baking world. He leaned over the first loaf. With a swift, confident motion, he slashed the top of the dough. Zip. A clean cut appeared. He did it again. Zip. This wasn't just for decoration. It allowed the bread to expand in the oven without tearing. It was called scoring. He opened the heavy iron door of the oven. A wave of intense, dry heat rolled out, hitting his face. It felt wonderful against the chill of the night. He slid the peel into the dark, fiery maw of the oven. With a quick jerk of his wrist, he deposited the loaf onto the hot stone floor. Slide, snap. He repeated this until the oven was full. Then he closed the door. Clang. And now the alchemy began. Inside the dark chamber, the intense heat was transforming the dough. The water inside was turning to steam, pushing the bread upward, making it rise one last, glorious time. The sugars on the surface were caramelizing, turning from pale white to golden, then to a deep, rich mahogany. Slowly, the smell began to change. At first, it was just the smell of burning wood, but then a new scent began to weave through the air. It was the smell of baking bread. It is perhaps the most comforting smell in human history. It smells of safety. It smells of hunger being satisfied. It smells of home. The aroma filled the kitchen, growing stronger and richer by the minute. It drifted into the corners, masking the smell of the damp snow outside. It settled in Julian's clothes, in his hair. It was a warm, enveloping embrace that made the bakery feel like the center of the universe. While the bread baked, Julian turned his attention to something sweeter. The morning regulars would want their pastries. He went to the refrigerator and pulled out a block of chilled dough he had prepared the day before. This was for the croissants. Layers of butter and dough folded over and over again until there were hundreds of thin sheets waiting to puff up. He rolled out the dough on the cool marble section of the counter. The rolling pin made a rhythmic thump, roll sound. He cut the dough into triangles. He took a piece of dark, bitter chocolate and placed it at the base of a triangle. He rolled it up, tight, precise, a perfect crescent. He worked methodically, his hands moving with muscle memory. There was no need to think. The repetitive motion was a meditation. Roll, place, shape. Roll, place, shape. Outside, the heavy snowfall began to lighten. The storm was passing. The wind died down, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt holy. The clouds thinned, and for a brief moment, the moon broke through. A beam of pale silver moonlight sliced through the bakery window. It cut across the flour-dusted air, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny stars. It fell across the wooden table, mixing with the warm orange glow of the fire. Julian paused. He looked at the interplay of light, the cold silver of the moon and the warm gold of the fire. It was a perfect balance. Yin and yang, night and day, winter and warmth. He checked his watch. 5 a.m. The village would be waking up soon. The first lights would flick on in the cottages on the hillside. The snowplows would start their rumble. But not yet. For now, the bread was almost done. He could hear the crust singing, a faint crackling sound coming from inside the oven as the bread settled. Crackle, snap, pop. It was the song of the bakery. Julian leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He felt a deep, heavy tiredness in his legs, but it was a good tiredness. The tiredness of a job well done. He looked at Barnaby, still sleeping, still purring. He looked at the oven. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the intoxicating perfume of fresh bread, and let his shoulders drop. The hardest work was done. Now he just had to wait. The Julian pulled on a pair of heavy, heat-resistant leather mittens. He opened the iron door of the oven one last time. The heat that rolled out now was different. It was laden with moisture and the heavy, intoxicating scent of fully baked sourdough. He slid the wooden peel under the first loaf and pulled it out. It was magnificent. The loaf had transformed from a pale, sticky dough into a dark, golden brown masterpiece. The ear, the ridge created by his scoring, had lifted perfectly, crisp and dark. He tapped the bottom of the loaf. Thump, thump. It sounded hollow, like a drum. That was the sound of perfection. He pulled them out, one by one, lining them up on the cooling rack near the window. 12 perfect loaves. As they hit the cooler air of the bakery, they began to sing. It was a faint crackling sound, a series of tiny snaps and pops as the crust contracted. Snap, crackle, pop. To a baker, this was the most beautiful music on earth. It meant the bread was alive. Julian took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the warm, yeasty air. The smell was so rich you could almost taste it. It was the smell of comfort, deep and primal. Outside, the world was waking up. The gray light of dawn was slowly bleeding into the deep blue of the night. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the village of St. Clair covered in a thick, untouched duvet of white. Then the silence was broken. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps on the snow. Julian smiled. He knew who it was. He walked to the front door and unlocked it just as the handle turned. It was Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived 3 houses down. She was wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, her cheeks pink from the cold morning air. "Good morning, Julian," she whispered, her voice puffing out in a cloud of steam. "Good morning, Martha," Julian replied softly. "Come in, warm up." She stepped inside, stamping the snow from her boots. "Ah, that smell," she sighed, closing her eyes. "It's the only reason I get out of bed in this weather." Julian didn't ask what she wanted. He knew. He reached for a paper bag and used a pair of tongs to select the darkest, crunchiest loaf from the rack. He slid it into the bag. The heat from the bread radiated through the paper. He also added 2 warm croissants, the chocolate inside still melted and gooey. He handed her the bag. "Careful, it's hot." "Bless you, Julian," she said, clutching the warm bag to her chest like a hot water bottle. "You keep us all going." She left, and the bell jingled again. Ding-a-ling. Over the next hour, a few more villagers trickled in. They spoke in hushed tones, respecting the quiet of the morning. They were sleepy, soft-faced, grateful for the warmth of the bakery. Julian served them all with a quiet grace. There was no need for rushing. The storm had slowed everything down. By 7 a.m., the rush was over. The sun had finally crested the mountains, painting the snow in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The light poured through the bakery window, illuminating the flour dust that still hung in the air, turning the room into a golden cathedral. Barnaby the cat finally woke up. He stretched, yawned, and walked over to his bowl, where Julian had already poured fresh milk. Julian White's work was done. The shelves were stocked, the village was fed, and the oven was slowly cooling down. He walked over to the display case and picked out a plain croissant for himself. He poured a fresh cup of coffee, hot, black, and steaming. He took his breakfast to the small table by the window. He sat down, his bones heavy with a pleasant exhaustion. He took a bite of the pastry. It shattered, flaky, buttery, perfect. He took a sip of coffee. The warmth spread through his chest. He looked out the window one last time. The village was fully awake now. He saw children pulling sleds, their laughter muffled by the thick glass. He saw smoke rising from chimneys. He saw the world turning. But in here, the day was ending. Julian finished his coffee. He leaned his head back against the wooden chair. The heat from the oven was still radiating across the room, wrapping him in a warm embrace. Barnaby jumped up onto his lap, curling into a heavy, purring ball. Julian's eyelids fluttered. The rhythmic ticking of the clock seemed to slow down. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The smell of the bread was a heavy, comforting blanket. He had kept the watch. He had fed the fire. He had baked the bread. Now it was his turn to rest. The golden light of the morning sun warmed his face. His breathing deepened, matching the slow purr of the cat. And there, in the quiet heart of the bakery, surrounded by the scent of yeast and the warmth of the hearth, the baker of St. Clair finally, peacefully drifted off to sleep. And so, our story comes to a gentle close. May your mind be calm,
and your dreams be kind. If you're still listening, we'll be waiting for you here again with another story from Midnight Murmurs Studio. Until then, sleep well.